Yeah, we put on art exhibitions, mostly around LA. Yeah. And we started out in the lobby of an office building in Koreatown. Every few months we would put in an installation of different artists. And then it became a...
All right, welcome everyone to Hotels in Crisis again. This is an exhibition that came together really out of the archive that's here at the Skid Row Museum. If you don't know this space, I feel like many of you do know this space, but if you don't know this space, it's a community space. We do all kinds of things here, open mics, film nights. People just come in for all kinds of reasons, and we do all kinds of programming here, amongst them exhibitions. And LA Comedy Department has been operating in Skid Row really since the last Olympics. So this is sort of like an interesting kind of, one person who came here early on for one of our programs described it as a real time is a flat circle kind of experience, sort of seeing this archive that has been built up over the last 40 years kind of become relevant again and again and again. So this exhibit came about, I want to say, partly it was sort of instigated by this kind of strange donation that was made to the Academy Museum and Archive, the Film Archive, where an unnamed kind of anonymous documentary filmmaker submitted all this footage and said, this might be relevant to this museum. And it's of all these residential hotels being destroyed in 1969. So that's a film still from it. Some of that footage loops on this screen here. And it became really interesting to sort of look at that moment of destruction and kind of the organizing that came out of it. And sort of see, this kind of path of kind of hopelessness into organizing, into like a really kind of hopeful moment, and then seeing that kind of devolve in a way, and now we're in a new crisis. So the components of this exhibit, and the way that I like to work and the way I sort of think, I kind of like to think of myself as an ignorant person who's trying to figure something out, and then tries to pull people along as I kind of piece something together, and hopefully in that, by kind of starting from that place of like, I don't really know that much about this. How can I kind of figure it out and sort of put it up on a wall in a way that kind of provokes more and more conversation? So along this wall here, we have a timeline that goes from the 1800s. And so single room occupancy hotels and sort of residential hotels started out in that time period as a for-profit model of housing. This is housing that was just abundant in a sense. At one point by 1960, there was about 15,000 units right here in Skid Row. And you sort of see here, from 1960 and 1977, almost half of those units are being demolished. People sort of think of them as like, this is housing that doesn't work. And then you have people looking at that saying, well, this is actually really critical housing. There's not any other housing that's getting built at this time that serves that community, the people who are living there. And so people who are losing their homes due to this demolition don't have like an alternative means of staying housed. So through that, you sort of see the creation of things like the SRO Housing Corporation in 1984 and Skid Row Housing Trust in 1989, and people who are doing work and living in Skid Row realizing, can we create nonprofits? Can we organize people to take over these buildings and actually run them as nonprofit housing? So kind of moving from this model of sort of like, this is just something that the market used to be able to provide, and now that the housing system is so broken, it becomes part of like the public housing stock in a sense. And then you have this period, the other thing that kind of necessitated this kind of moment is the dissolution of Skid Row Housing Trust, which happened in 2025, and you see all these buildings kind of go into receivership. The city owns them, the city's trying to figure out what to do with them, and they make some very questionable decisions. The most kind of like, the biggest flashpoint, I guess, of them is sort of giving them 19 of these buildings to a for-profit housing developer from Beverly Hills, who has some sort of
terrible
Leo. Yeah, so Leo Pastilnikov is kind of like a bête noire of this whole story. as this person who doesn't seem to really have a clear plan, but is somehow convinced that he's going to figure out a way to make this housing work, even though he has no sort of resources to do so. So we started out by making this timeline and then holding a series of conversations in this space, looking at the past. So we screened footage on the screen again, with this footage from 1969, and again footage that LA Poverty Department collected through their Walk the Talk archive, and then there's a film by Naomi Hirahara about single-room occupancy hotels in Little Tokyo from 1989. So sort of looking at that footage and then talking about it. What's changed? What's different? How are these problems kind of occurring in a different form today? Our second panel was about sort of specifically talking to policy experts who looked at the way that Skid Row Housing Trust fell apart and why. And then our third panel was about sort of what do we do? What are the options that we have? So another thing that happens in this space every Wednesday, the Los Angeles Tenants Union meets here. And so through meetings with them, we sort of figured out what would be useful, what's interesting to talk about. And so one of the things that we put up here is there's almost 60 SROs. And so this is just less than half of them. But just to give you a sense of how much housing there is here at stake still. And each of these buildings has their own sort of unique set of problems, their unique set of solutions, different kinds of people who are organizing them, different ownership in them. And so the hope is that as that group meets here, we can start to kind of continue to build out our analysis of what's happening in each of these buildings. And it becomes a place for those conversations and that kind of analysis to have this physical forum and a space here that can accumulate over time, and we can start to figure out where do we go from here. Some of the things that and then so on this screen we have edited versions of those panels, different people who are policy experts, people who are organizers, people who are tenants with lived experience, sort of talking about this situation and thinking through what can be done now. Some of the things that were really clear to me, moderating those panel discussions and talking with people, is that there really is no path for SROs to work as for-profit housing, where just the net operating expenses really exceed the incomes that are presently available to go inside. So we have this kind of intractable solution or intractable problem if you just consider the housing market as it is today. And so we sort of see people talking about these different situations. So we have folks like Mike Alvidrez, who was the former CEO, saying, is there something that we could have done differently? And he was very flat, no, absolutely not. And there's other people who contest this, but in his mind, the numbers just don't pencil out. There's no way to kind of solve this in our existing system. And then Jerry Jones here has, I think, a really great analysis where he's talking about sort of the intentionality of this situation. It's not a problem that just happened accidentally. So my first housing, this is almost 25 years ago, the first housing that I ever paid for, was in an SRO in New York City. I lived in a building called the Times Square, and that was one of the first supportive housing developments in the country. So it was housing that was meant for individual people, there's social services attached, and it really worked. It was a really kind of functional place. It didn't have maintenance issues, it didn't have safety issues. All those things were really taken care of because there is a lot of funding that was put into it. And so Jerry sort of talks about this is very intentional. This is very similar to the playbook that happened to public housing, where if you defund something so deeply that it doesn't work, then it becomes really easy to demonize it and to say, well, we have to just destroy these things again or just get rid of them in some way. And that's sort of where the city thus far has kind of been at. It's we're just trying to rid our hands of these buildings. We'll let somebody else figure it out. But if you think about it, this is our next kind of point. There's someone, Mark Toussignant, who is the director of housing for Enterprise. If you look at those buildings, the cost it would take per unit to rehab those buildings completely, fully bring them up to kind of modern standards, he thinks it's about $90,000 per unit. And if you think about that versus what it costs to build a new unit in today's market, that's $100,000, right? Or close to $1 million to build a brand new unit of housing. So the difference is really clear. If we lose this housing, we're losing housing that we're not going to get back, and it will cost many, many, many orders of magnitude to replace in some way. So then we got to get to the folks who are thinking about what are the solutions? How do we figure the next steps out? And some of the things that I think are really interesting here is that, and this is something that Becky Dennison down there at the bottom sort of talked about. She's from Legal Aid Foundation Los Angeles Now, previously was LA Can, a lot of other organizations, Venice Community Housing. She talks about how residential hotels tenants, both as buildings and as tenants, they have more protections than almost any other kind of tenant out there. And so there are theoretically these really, really clear legal mechanisms to kind of protect this housing and organize around it. She also notes it doesn't feel like that because the enforcement is so limited. But in terms of the law, there's a lot of hope and a lot of things that you can work on to kind of build that back. And then sort of the last piece here is that there are these kind of like existing mechanisms that are designed for supporting and renovating and keeping those housing stocks together. So something like ULA funding, that's something that you really can do, and it is a real hope that you can tap that funding, find a way to kind of solve this problem and kind of pull it together, at least in the interim. So here we have kind of the outcome of those conversations. These are all different ideas that tenants and organizers came up with. So different organizations like LA Can or the Skid Row Action Plan, were able to kind of come together in this space and lay out all the different things that they think need to happen. And then here we have sort of like what we learned, where we're at, and then still some questions we have. And this exhibit will be up for a while. I'm hoping that we can kind of all add to it. And it becomes kind of like a war room, or like that's a bad metaphor, but it becomes a place where people can get together their strategy and help kind of build an analysis that will then lead us to be able to act in a coordinated way to kind of use the mechanisms that are available to kind of push through and kind of get to a different solution than we have now, which seems to be just the city turning its back and abandoning these kinds of units. So that's the point of this exhibit, is sort of bring that history together and kind of bring it into the present and make it speak to the present moment as a tool for organizing and thinking about the future. So I like to think of the work that I do, especially in this space, as, how do you build a learning environment? So this is, in a sense, it's an exhibit, but when it comes alive, I think, is in these moments when people are just here for other reasons, and they start to kind of figure out, like, oh, I actually see this in my own life. This reminds me of something I know, and they can add that together, and it becomes something that is a shared understanding. So that's the idea of the exhibit. So there is a kind of piece where, like, it really is a place where, like, you need to complete the exhibit in a sense. So if you know something either on this timeline, if you know something that's going on in one of these buildings, please feel very welcome, invited to like add your thoughts to it. We want to kind of keep on building this story, and all of the people who come through this space have so much different kinds of expertise, so many kinds of expertise, that I really hope can kind of keep on accumulating here. So at this opening, but also anytime you're back in here, please add your own thoughts on here. And if there's something you're like, this is an important issue that's not being talked about, by all means, throw it up on the wall.
All right, thank you.